ever since the announcement of the Essential Legends collection almost 2 years ago, it has received a ton of criticism for many aspects. Now, with this most recent wave, many, including myself, have taken to criticizing exactly which titles are getting the Essential Legends moniker and some of the decision making behind why certain titles are being included. Now, I was talking with Chris Nelson about this fairly recently, and he suggested that we do something along the lines of making our own version of an Essential Legends collection of what we would consider to be the essential stories, and sort of broke down what the waves would look like. And I like the idea so much, and since Chris is basically not probably going to be able to do a stream anytime in the future, I thought, well, I might as well do it myself. Now, first, some things I will not be covering. Just to go over real quickly, I won't be covering the artwork that these covers would have. I agree that the artwork has been subpar, and in almost every single case has been inferior to the original artwork. I would like to give these their own unique artwork, but I won't be touching upon that as art is not my specialty. I will also not be covering any additional content on top that these would have. These would be like short stories, potential short stories, authors' interviews, etc. As I think these are a little bit outside the scope of the Essential Legends collection, and unfortunately, many of the authors who wrote these stories are no longer with us and unable to provide said content. I will also not be going too deeply into the unabridged audiobooks. Just assume every book on this list that doesn't have an unabridged audiobook prior to when the Essential Legends collection would get one. I would include them and I would make them for all of them. And you'll see in my list, anything that is bold means it doesn't have an unabridged audiobook and would get one in my list. And finally, I will not be discussing things Del Rey does not actually have the rights to, as this is a Del Rey publishing project. It is limited in scope to what Del Rey can actually reprint, which is essentially the things they have the rights to. So I won't be talking about Dark Horse Comics or the graphic novels that they made, which made these consider essential. I will also not be talking about the young adult books, primarily because they are almost in all cases published by someone that is not Del Rey, therefore they don't have the rights, therefore they would not be included. Now, when I think of this question of what is essential within the expanded universe, in my view, there are two stories that are the quintessential creme de la creme of all of EU storytelling, that everything is pretty much built around. That if you were going to tell the story, you would tell these two. And I think those two stories are The New Jedi Order and The Revenge of the Sith. Now, this isn't to say that the Essential Legends collection would only have the 19 books of New Jedi Order and The Revenge of the Sith in this ideal world. That is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is I think the Essential Legends collection should build up to these two essential stories. And the way that you could do that in the wave release, where you are getting 3 to 4 books per wave every about 3-ish months, would be to start chronologically. Treat it not as a reprinting of all these books with like brand new fancy colors, but covers, but actually as a a chronological like recommended reading order for how you could get to these stories, the fastest way to get to these stories and to hit all the important beats up until those stories, and use that as the vehicle for telling what are the essential stories. Now, you maybe hear me talk about this and think, well, that's all and good, but there are a lot of stories that don't directly tie into either of these two storylines that I would consider as essential. And I generally agree for this. So, in my view, I think that the stories would basically get into three categories. Ones that would go with the New Jedi Order storyline, ones with the Revenge of the Sith storyline, and then a third miscellaneous storyline of the additional essential stories that don't necessarily play into one of those. And each wave would feature at least one book from all three categories. These would include, I'll go into a bit more detail later, but just some examples of these stories would be Splinter of the Mind's Eye, as it's the very first EU novel, very groundbreaking for that, and I think should definitely be on these lists. Also, stuff like the Han Solo trilogy, either the A.C. Crispin or the Brian Daley ones. I tend to favor the AC Crispin ones, though that might just be a personal preference. But they're both very good stories, and ideally you'd probably want them both. But something like that would be in there. Also, something like the Kenobi novel, which doesn't directly tie into, say, the Revenge of the Sith storyline, but does offer a good epilogue to that story, would also be a good addition into these other categories. And finally, things like the X-wing series or Rogue Squadron and the Race Squadron arc, although they again do kind of build into the New Jedi Order storyline and are somewhat tangentially related and do have some callbacks once New Jedi Order happens, they're not essentially essential to telling that story, but they are good supplements and in of themselves are pretty essential to the overall story of what happened in the expanded universe. Now, what I mean by story is when I talk about the essential legends, right? I'm purely talking about when you take the actual overarching story of these storylines of the entire expanded universe, right? What are the essential stories to tell? I've generally favored the stories that are of higher quality, and left kind of behind these stories that don't necessarily fit into that overall theme or are kind of important but not really important to telling the story, and the ones that are generally thought of as sub caliber. Now, as for the NJO stories, what would these look like? Well, I think the first obvious one is, of course, the Thrawn trilogy, and I also think that this from a reading standpoint is important to start off with, because again, the waves will also not only just be it's not a matter of wave one is more essential than wave two. It's that if you are reading these books, you could use the waves as a pseudo reading order. So you could, again, these books would be released every about 3-ish months. They'll be 3 to 4. In most cases, they're 4 books. So you have 4 months to read them. But if you want to get the essential story and kind of just, branch off and jump between eras, you could use the waves as a reading order of how you would get to these stories, a sort of like a fast track. And really, with this Essential Legends collection, I think that's the way you would have to do it, because most of us who already know the story, who have these stories already, we're not really that interested in these things other than the unabridged audiobooks. But you could use it as a marketing tool to get new people into the universe and kind of solve the problem of where do I start, what's the reading order, what do I need to read with this. So moving on from the Thrawn trilogy, I think the next you would have to tell would be the Jedi Academy trilogy. Although Anderson is a little bit controversial and some people think these are of lower quality, I think that they generally do matter in that the telling of the story of Luke's first class of Jedi Knights is incredibly important to tell. It introduces us to a lot of characters, as does the Thrawn trilogy prior to it, that will become immensely important down the line. Now, following in that, this one I didn't have originally, but the more and more I thought of it, the more I realized that from a storytelling perspective, it has to be in there. And that is Darksaber. Now, you may be asking, why do I have Darksaber but not the other two of the unofficial Callista trilogy, the Barbara Hambly books? Well, first off, I think the Barbara Hambly books are generally of lower quality than some of the other ones. Also, this list is already going to be pretty Bantam heavy, so a lot of exclusions from the Bantam era got cut simply because I'm trying to pick the stories that are absolutely necessary. And I think from an overall storytelling standpoint of the state of the galaxy, Darksaber is incredibly important, because prior to Darksaber, you have an empire which is divided, has a bunch of different warlords milling around, and can't find a unified leader and are not really a threat. By the end of Darksaber, you have an empire that is united under Pelion. Without Darksaber, you would just go into the Hand of Thrawn duology, spoilers that is on here, having gone from the fractured empire to the unified empire. In my opinion, you need to tell the story, not only to wrap up Dalla's older storyline, which is why it's here, because you get Dalla's failure in the Jedi Academy trilogy, and then you get her bit of triumph in unifying the empire, and then ultimate failure at the during the events of the Battle of Yavin during Darksaber. And then it leads us off to why Pelion is in charge of the Empire once he becomes once that becomes an issue later in the Hand of Thrawn duology. Also, I would have the Carillion trilogy from the Bantam era. I think this is important in a few ways. Is that the first is that it's the first major story that actually puts the Solo children in the front line and actually has them impacting the story in ways. You get a lot of their personalities, you get a lot of their quirks in the story. It also greatly sets up Corellia, which is an important plot point later down the road, especially with Centerpoint Station and Anakin's connection to Centerpoint Station and why that exists, which is a major plot point early on in New Jedi Order. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the Hand of Thrawn duology. This is just a really good story to kind of wrap up the Bantam era and lead us into the New Jedi Order state of the galaxy, where the Second Galactic War is over, the Imperial remnants and the New Republic are at peace, a shaky peace, but they are largely at peace and consider each other as valid forms of government. And then, of course, we have New Jedi Order itself. You will have noticed that I have combined all of the duologies and trilogies um, into one story, similar thing to what the hardcover reprints did. I think this is good on two fronts. First, it allows us to get through these stories in the wave structure a lot quicker, just so that it does not take 19 waves to get through New Jedi Order. But also these individual duologies and trilogies within the story, each their subsequent parts definitely feel more like a part one of or half of a story if than trilogies and duologies elsewhere. So I think it just naturally fits to make them so that they are combined in this way. Now, you may be noticing that there's a lot of stuff missing, as I said, that could kind of directly relate to this New Jedi Order storyline, especially with starting in with Heir to the Empire. There's a lot of stories that people would consider essential that happen chronologically before that. So what have I done with them? Well, I have added them in to the other section as sort of supplemental to this storyline, not exactly necessary, but or essential, but still good stories to tell, and that will come in later down the line, all of them prior to when we get to New Jedi Order. These include the Truce of Bakura, which I know a lot of people like a lot. The X-Wing series, first off, books 1 through 7, getting us all the way through the Rogue and Race Squadron arcs, and then after book 7, I think is a very nice point to add in the Courtship of Princess Leia, as Solo Command does lead very well into Courtship of Princess Leia, mainly with Warlord Zinja and his story, of the New Republic trying to take him down. Well, that is all set up in the Race Squadron arc, and then Courtship finishes off that storyline. And then the final two Bantam novels of the X-Wing series. Now, I also think that you could, if you were telling the overall story of Star Wars, you can't really end at New Jedi Order. The post Jedi storyline of the main series of novels, although you can definitely argue that the quality dropped with Legacy of the Force and Fate of the Jedi, I still think they're important to tell as the kind of essential story of, if you wonder what's essential from the expanded universe, it's what happened after Endor, the state of the galaxy after Endor. So I have these here as sort of an epilogue to the New Jedi Order storyline. Now, as for the Revenge of the Sith storyline, this is a lot smaller than the New Jedi Order storyline because uh, there wasn't a decade to build these up. There was only the course of the prequels, which only took about 6 years. So less stories were made, and I also think that less stories that were made in that time were actually essential to tell the story, at least when you're talking about novels. But I would start with the Bane trilogy, as it sets up how the Sith became what they were in the Old Republic to what they were in the Rule of Two, and sets up Bane's idea of the Grand Plan and the eventual revenge they would have against the Jedi. And that would transition perfectly into Darth Plagueis, the end of the Bane line, with Palpatine's backstory and Plagueis and all their inner machinations that lead into the Phantom Menace and their overall plan to take down the Jedi. Then, of course, you would have Cloak of Deception, which gives you a lot of Valorum's, excuse me, which gives you a lot of a view into the Republic and the politicking and the just the decadence of it, and all the scheming that Palpatine is doing and the Trade Federation leading up to the Phantom Menace. I also think you would have Darth Maul Shadowhunter both as a good Darth Maul novel and as a setup that kind of ties in with Plagueis and with the overall storyline getting to the Phantom Menace. That's why I chose Shadowhunter over Lockdown, as Shadowhunter was written at the time of these other novels, so it could branch off and still tell the overall story, whereas Lockdown came much later and kind of had to retroactively fit itself in where its predecessor novels didn't really mention it. And finally, I would have the novelization. So Phantom Menace would be in there, definitely essential to telling the story of Revenge of the Sith. Once we get out of Phantom Menace, I would have Rogue Planet as a good early Anakin story, and also a story that's doing double duty, telling some of the backstory to the New Jedi Order plotline as well. I would then have Attack of the Clones, pretty self-explanatory there. I would then have Shatterpoint, not in the first wave, but much later down the line, though I do think it's still essential in telling Mace Windu's side of the story of what he was going through in the Clone Wars, and kind of as showing his psyche going into the Revenge of the Sith novel, how he thinks about the light and the dark, and even in the Revenge of the Sith novel, as you get into Mace's head, a lot of it in that, I think Shatterpoint is a good novel to start out with, and to not start out with, I'm sorry, good novel to read to kind of get you into his head and explain why he makes the decisions that he does later on in Revenge of the Sith. Yoda Dark Rendezvous is a very good story, I think, to include as well, getting into both Yoda and Count Dooku's psyche, into why they are the way they are and their relationship there. I think there isn't a better novel that can accomplish that. Of course, as we are leading up to Revenge of the Sith, we have to have Labyrinth of Evil in there. I think that is pretty self-explanatory. And of course, Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. Now, I would also have the Republic Commando series kind of sprinkled in here, where they've come up chronologically. I don't actually think that the Republic Commando series is essential to tell the story of Revenge of the Sith, although they do complement it. But I do think, even with their controversy with them and their and Karen Traviss has within the rest of the fandom, they have enough of a strong fan base, and they do a lot of the really lore building work into the culture of the Mandalorians, at least within Legends, that I do think they are essential to include in this collection. And I would, as I said, sprinkle them in where they fit chronologically into this overall story of the Revenge of the Sith. I would also have Outbound Flight in here, again, sprinkled in where it fits in chronologically. Semi-obvious reasons. I don't think it's essential into telling the Revenge of the Sith storyline, but it is from that era, and I do think it's a pretty good novel to include in the Essential Legends collection overall. And finally, kind of on the note of Kenobi, I would have Dark Lord: The Rise of Darth Vader as a epilogue novel into how we transition from the Revenge of the Sith to the galaxy as we know it in the original trilogy, and as a nice epilogue into Darth Vader, or Anakin's fall into what he eventually becomes. Now, these are the other novels that I have on here that don't fit into either of these categories, but I still think are pretty essential into telling. And you'll notice that this is not a complete list. In my wave structure later, you'll notice I have 7 open slots. So anything that I don't have on here can easily be fit in. Let me know if you think any of the stories I included could be also included here, as there's a lot that really could be considered essential, and there's a lot of weird judgment calls on that. But some of the obvious ones, I think, are Splinter of the Mind's Eye, as I said earlier, very fundamental novel into the expanded universe. I also think Shadows of the Empire is a very essential one to tell the Kenobi novel, as I said earlier, the Han Solo trilogy. It can be either one. I chose the A.C. Crispin one here. Death Troopers, I think, is a very good horror novel that a lot of people love, so it would make sense to include. I would put the Old Republic Revan and Deceived. I think they are the more the higher quality ones, and with Revan specifically, telling the story of both between the two games and what happened after, I think is very essential into telling the overall storyline. I will then have Death Star as a kind of amalgamation of all the different stories of how the Death Star plans were stolen. It works great for that. I would think that is very essential. I would also have the MedStar duology here, as it's a very good Clone Wars novel. Um, one of the uh, one of the better Clone Wars novels. The Clone Wars eras and novels are kind of lackluster, but I think these are two good ones to tell. Not exactly essential into telling the fall of the Revenge of the Sith, but I still think are essential to tell there. And I also think Millennium Falcon is a very good one to include, probably after Legacy of the Force, but as a good epilogue to that story, and also as a telling of the history of the Millennium Falcon. And then also X-Wing and Mercy Kill, which I think would be chronologically the last book I would put in here. But just to kind of wrap up the Ray Squadron arc, it's a very much a where are they now 30 years later in the state of the galaxy thing. A very fun story as well that I would include. Now, as for the waves, you can see the key up top on the top right indicates which novels belong to which categories and how I would structure them. Not going to go too much into detail here, just kind of some broader points that I'm going to make. You can look at this yourself and see what you agree and disagree with in the reading order, but this is how I would do the waves. Again, each wave would be coming out every roughly 3 months apart from each other, just to give people time, people who are coming into this, who are buying them as they are coming out, time to read all of them and move on. I've also, as I said, I mentioned I combined the duologies and trilogies into one book. I've also tried to keep it so that there are no more than five actual books per wave. So I try not to double up on that wave, which is why you'll see in wave 14 there is no flex spot uh, because Force Heretic is already 3 books. That gives us 5. So you have the New Jedi Order storyline, the Revenge of the Sith storyline, the miscellaneous stories, and then the Flex, which is basically just to kind of run through the New Jedi Order storyline a little quicker so that we can get these waves out faster and get through this in 24 waves. The 24 wave structure, again, every 3 months, means that we would get through this in 6 years, which I think is perfectly fine um, as a reprint run, essentially. Um, so that is, in broad strokes, how I would structure the waves. And again, many in the miscellaneous section there could be moved around and pushed back into the release order. I personally would probably keep Mercy Kill to the very end of in wave 24, as that's kind of where it fits in anyway, and then insert some other books um, that you would think would be essential, or that kind of like the niche cases in all of this. Those other books for this final 7 slots, I was thinking um, some of the ones I considered adding but didn't add, but like I can see an argument for, would be as I said, the Han Solo and Lando adventures. These I would keep as a 3-in-1. Just again, they're very short books, so I think it works a lot better as a 3-in-1 than individual books. But just to kind of put more books out there into the waves. I also think the Bounty Hunter Wars is definitely up for consideration here. That whole trilogy is pretty good. I don't know where you would put it. I would probably leave it till the later era, as the beginning waves are really Bantam heavy. So kind of like so that there isn't too much Bantam fatigue in that early time period. I go back and forth on the Darkness trilogy. I don't think quality wise it's anywhere near as good as Legacy of the Force or Fate of the Jedi, which are already a step down from New Jedi Order. But it does have a little bit of the reasoning behind Jason's eventual fall. I would probably do what the hardcovers did and put these all into one book if I included them at all. I could be convinced either way on that one. I also think since we have most of the Jax Pavin saga already, might as well make the Coruscant Knights trilogy. I don't think I'd put Last Jedi in here, both as to avoid confusion with the movie, but also as it's vastly inferior to what came before it, in my opinion. And then I also think the Black Fleet Crisis was an unfortunate casualty to the Bantam heavy early waves. I know it's very controversial. I think it's pretty good, and it very tonally sets up the Long War. It's one of the more darker stories in the Bantam era, so you kind of get a little your foot in the water in there. But is it been really important to the overall story? Not really, but I think it's pretty good, and it definitely, in my opinion, if you're not going to have the Lando Calrissian adventures, I definitely think you need Black Fleet Crisis, as it has, in my opinion, the best Lando story out in the expanded universe. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention the Crystal Star, which has had a huge resurgence in the last few years in popularity. Once the joke of the EU, now held up as one of the better novels. I don't know how much of that is akin to itself or New Generations, but I know all the comments would be memeing on me if I didn't mention the Crystal Star. So that is fairly briefly in like 25 minutes how I would do the Essential Legends collection and how I'd structured the waves. Let me know your thoughts. I don't know if I'll ever do another video again. I literally just made this just because I didn't want to wait around a year for Chris to be able to record these things again. So that's all. Take care.